arguably many people would think, when you hear about the suffragettes, there's adverts utilising their backgrounds on the TV all the time, from DNA ads and everything else. They're very well known. Most people, when you would say the suffragettes, will at least know something about them or what they've done, but arguably will probably not know about Black women being left behind, about Black women not having the vote when white women did, and that being diametrically opposed by many of the leading suffragettes as well. And what I think is so important about this, and in that example, is that we share those stories that, but yes, we can recognise that the advancement of white women in this scenario was historic, that getting white women the vote was phenomenal, but that doesn't mean we also can't recognise that there was racism involved and that Black women were left behind as well, and that Sojourner Truth was the person who pushed to help Black women get the vote. So I think it's so important that we don't lose the nuance of stories.
Hi, my name is Nadia Nagamutu, business psychologist, coach, speaker and founder of Avenir Consulting, which creates organisational growth and success via inclusion and diversity. We've been discussing the benefits that diversity brings to companies' bottom line performance for decades with more and more evidence. But there are so many questions organisations still have about how to achieve it. How do you create a culture where people feel valued for their uniqueness and the qualities they bring? I believe it's crucial to the future success and sustainability of every organisation that they find the answer to this question, to make sure that each employee is not only supported but also appreciated. With this podcast, I aim to get some of the key challenges to creating inclusive workplaces out in the open and start uncovering the solutions to embracing a culture that cares for everyone. I'm going to be having conversations with some of the most inspiring people in different countries and across industries who are pushing the boundaries on inclusion and diversity in the workplace, from topics such as parenting in the workplace, ethnicity, age, gender, mental health, and all things inclusion. I want to create a movement to change society through sharing life experiences and creating more empathy and connection. Why care? I believe that once we have organisations and societies that accept and value everyone for who they are, we become healthier, happier, and better in our roles both inside and outside work. Hello, and welcome to episode 36 of Why Care. My name is Nadia Nagamutu, and I am your host. I've been wanting to speak to Sheree Atcheson for some time, and so for me, this is truly a pleasure to have her on the show. Sheree is a global diversity and inclusion senior executive currently working at Valtech, and previously Deloitte, Monzo, and Peakon. She's listed as one of the UK's top most influential women in tech, and an international multi-award winner for her services to diversity and inclusion in industry. She sits on the advisory board for Women Who Code and is also a Forbes contributor. We delve deeply into Sheree's book, Demanding More, which explains how deliberate exclusion plays out in our society and how we all need to demand more of the system in order to create inclusion. We discuss white saviourism, white feminism, and have a fascinating conversation about the suffragette, intersectionality and the common pitfalls organisations make in creating diversity, equity and inclusion strategies. And I get Sheree's views on the recent US Supreme Court ruling against race-based selection. Sheree also offers her advice on the two most effective ways we should demand more of organisations. Enjoy. I am incredibly excited to speak to you, Sheree. Thank you so much for joining me on Why Care.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Well, I've followed you and I continue to be completely inspired by your work, by everything that you do in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. I have loved reading your book, Demanding More. Thank you very much for sharing all that you have in this book, and I highly recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it yet. For those who don't know you, as well as I do, having stalked you, would you be able to share a little bit more about your background and also a bit about Demanding More and how you came to write it?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Sheree and I've been doing senior diversity and inclusion leadership for over 12 years now. And I've held lots of different roles, particularly in technology companies. I started my career as an engineer, working on high-profile public sector projects, mostly in the UK at that stage. And then I started moving into diversity and inclusion work because, for obvious reasons, there wasn't very many women on my team and certainly very much else diversity when it came to engineering. At that stage, I wanted to do something different, but I don't like reinventing the wheel. I don't like repeating myself. I don't like doing things that if someone else has already done them, I can amplify that instead of doing something just so it has my name on it. And I found Women Who Code.
Yes.
Women Who Code at that stage was a small global nonprofit, but primarily just focusing in San Francisco and in India, where they had around 2,500, 3,000 global members. But what they did was they ran free monthly meetups, free monthly events on the specialities that were being hired on in the areas where people lived and worked. So their goal was really to bring people together, to give them the skills they needed, and to do that all for free. And the for free part was something that was very important to me because of my own background growing up very, very poor. And instead of creating something new, creating a new community, etc., I spent a lot of time talking to the CEO of Women Who Code, understanding that actually it hadn't been branched across Europe at that stage, it hadn't been branched across the UK, etc. And I was a fresh-faced graduate then in Belfast in the north of Ireland where I was working. And I branched it over to Belfast. We had a great response. We had a really big impact of bringing women together, learning the skills they needed, creating those networks that we then branched to London, Bristol, Edinburgh, down to Dublin, and then all across Europe as well. I sit as a board now for that non-profit. From there, I was doing essentially two jobs at once. I was being an engineer and I was also doing D&I consultancy with a lot of organisations at the same time for Women Who Code, helping them build communities, implement trainings and so on. And I got to a point in my career where I was doing two jobs and only one of them was the one I really cared about. And engineering wasn't that one. So I made a pivot and the rest is history. Now I am where I'm at. And I started to write Demanding More in March 2020, which was not a great time for anybody, I don't think, in the world. I had a publisher reach out to me who was interested in me writing a book because they'd read my pieces in Forbes and in The Guardian and Computer Weekly and stuff like that. The reason I said yes was I was really fed up of diversity and inclusion books that focused really only on 9 to 5. So how we do D&I from a 9 to 5 perspective without recognising that actually really embedding diversity, really fostering inclusion is how you live your life. You have to make life changes to change how we really interact in different ways. And the other thing I really didn't like was that a lot of books used words and phrases and terms that everyday people may not understand unless you were in the field. I don't like that because I feel like that's almost excluding people. Or I wanted to write a book that my 66-year-old white Irish dad would be able to lift up and get something from. No, he's not in the industry. No, he's not in business, but he could definitely get something about what he could do better as well. And that's why I wrote it. That's why when I wrote it, I guess it shoots from the hip. It's very straight talking. It's very in the way I speak as well. And I'm really proud of Demanding More and hopefully helping and changing how people do things, but helping them just literally demand more, stand up, ask for more in a way that feels purposeful and sustainable at the same time.
Yeah. And it is all of that. As I'm reading, I can hear you speaking. And I loved that about the book. Yeah. That's the storytelling. It was very personal in what you offered about yourself. There was a lot of humility there, actually, in your personal story, being adopted by white Irish parents. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more maybe about your personal story?
Yeah, of course. So I was adopted at 3 weeks old from Sri Lanka by two white working class Irish people. My parents couldn't have their own kids. They spent a lot of years trying IVF and stuff like that. And so they decided they wanted to then adopt kids and so adopted me and my brother, which took around 7 years at the time from sort of start of process to finish. And if you think about it, whenever my parents told me that at the start, I was, sort of shocked. But then I realised back then, you can't just send an email to the other side of the world. You have to send everything by paper. So it's all very, stagnant when you do a process like that anyway. But I was raised in the north of Ireland in a place called County Tyrone. Where I grew up is primarily farming land, agricultural, etc. So it's very rural. It's not very diverse. It's certainly more diverse now because of immigration and people moving in. But in the 90s, where I grew up, there wasn't any other people of colour that me or my brother knew except for each other. So a lot of people speak and understand, being the only, whether that's in your boardroom, whether that's in your team, etc. And I understand all of that as well. But being the only in your town or in your friend circle, in your school and so on, gives you a very different perspective on what that means. You're acutely aware of the difference that you have.
Right.
Because it's glaringly obvious. When we went to school with a sea of white faces and then our two faces, of course, which were South Asian, and we faced quite a lot of racism growing up, quite a lot of intense racism for sure, a lot of sort of fighting, etc., with schools, etc., to make sure that they had appropriate safeguarding measures and stuff for us. I always describe myself as both sort of underrepresented and privileged. You know, two things can be true at once.
Of course.
My parents were very poor, so they were working class. They ended up both disabled, so we're on disability benefits, and me and my brother were on free school meals. But because of that background that I have from a poor background and so on, I was able to get grants and bursaries to be the first Atcheson to go to university, to be the first person to do that, and to then sort of, I guess, carve a life out for myself. That access to opportunity is what a lot of my work is about, that whilst I'm very underrepresented and underprivileged in Ireland, there's still been access points to opportunity that I've been able to grab and take hold of to go to university, to now be able to create generational wealth in my family that didn't exist until me as well. Yeah. And the conversation is balanced, because I always say, you know, as a senior woman of colour in industry, I'm underrepresented, but as a senior woman of colour in industry, I'm also very privileged because I'm listened to. People listen when I speak now because of the seniority I have, because of the credibility that I've had. And of course, I've worked hard for that. But there's also been luck that's played into that too. You know, nobody is ever successful, in my view, without some luck playing into part, because there are lots of people that work really, really hard and to never get the success that they may want to achieve, because sometimes luck and privilege makes a difference, and that's where my privilege comes in. One of the things I'm acutely aware of is the conversation on what underrepresented or underprivileged means from a global perspective. So I've been back to Sri Lanka. I found my biological family and so on.
I know, I saw that. Yeah. How incredible.
It was definitely an experience. It's eye-opening. I mean, I've always been acutely aware of being adopted. My parents were always very open with me. My dad had always shared the photos and stuff that he had of him and my birth mother. But there's being aware of something and then seeing something in real life. It's just two different things.
Of course.
And you become very aware of the very different life that you would have had you not been put up for adoption. So I'm very grateful for that too. But again, when I talk about those access to opportunities, that split decision or that one decision that woman made has gave me access to all of these opportunities where, you know, I can have financial stability now. I have a partner I can comfortably talk about. I have my own house. I have all of these things that I don't have to worry about now. And that's where you'll have seen in Demanding More, the conversation on privilege is so nuanced that it isn't ones or zeros, but that it's very grayscale, and that in order to really move that conversation on, I think it's important to have those conversations. And that's why in Demanding More as well, I shared all of that, because I think it's very hard for people to visualize something without something to really bring it to life. And the nuances and complexities of my story, I think, help to do that in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is so much of you, as I say, in this book, and the storytelling is incredibly powerful. One of the things that you reflect on in the book is around white saviourism. And it's interesting as well, because if we think about just in general in the UK, certainly more Western societies, there are charities doing good work to support people in other parts of the world. Yeah. Like just thinking about in the UK, we have something called Red Nose Day, right? Where it's everyone chipping in as much as they can, raising money for those who need it, typically in Africa. It made me think, especially as you've just been speaking about your own sort of white Irish parents and that act that they offered, you know, to yourself, your brother, to bring you both into their family. Where's the line, do you feel, between white saviourism and, which is self-serving, versus what the charities are presumably trying to do, which is to create some support system for those who need it?
I think what's really important is the reasons and how you do these kinds of things. Are you trying to, in quotes, help people to elevate yourself, to show yourself as someone who is doing good deeds to help people that are more underprivileged or underserved than you, in a way to not focus on the fact that they may need some help that you can offer, but more to focus on elevating yourself and your own reputation? Those are two very different things. If it's to be seen as someone who does great things for these poor people in Sri Lanka or whatever else it might be, then that's white saviourism. If it's to really sit down and think about how you can make a difference, whether that's actively helping to send money directly to different communities, adoption and so on. I think it's really, really nuanced, but I think you have to really sit with yourself around why that is. I would say certainly, my dad really wanted to have kids and saw no other way of doing that. And I always regret he passed away not that long ago, a few years ago.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
And I always say now, I was like, I wish I had have asked him why he didn't adopt white Irish kids. What was the reason? I knew that the connection they made to Sri Lanka was because one of the nurses that they were doing IVF with had also adopted kids from Sri Lanka, so they'd made a connection in that way. I think it's a really big question. Certainly my mother did have elements of white saviourism, the way she spoke, the way she behaved and so on. It was very obvious that it was about doing this great deed. I did this great thing. I went to this country and saved these 2 brown babies. But I never had that from my father. So I think there's so much nuance in adoption. I also have a friend who's also been adopted from Sri Lanka. You actually might have seen her. She had a very different experience with her family in that they spent time, I think, really embracing the culture, learning about it and so on, whereas I didn't really learn anything, which I also think is a decision to be made. But I think in my case it was made out of ignorance, in that there was no real thought behind it, as opposed to we decided not to. And I think that's where, when it comes to adoption and so on, you really have to think about what that means or what that child will face. You bring a brown child to a very white space like the north of Ireland in the 90s, you must recognise that they're going to face racism. And in my case, that probably wasn't even really a consideration, which is very naive and very silly. But again, and this is what I say in the book as well, even with that consideration, and there's questions I don't have answers to, there's still a gratefulness of that access to opportunity, because I would not have the life I have now had I been in Sri Lanka. I have 2 half siblings there and we live very different lives, obviously. So
it's very complicated, yeah. But I get it. I get what you're saying is that it depends on the reasoning of what that person is thinking, the reason why they're doing something. Now, thinking about this concept of intersectionality, which you've sort of touched on a little bit already, but I was quite struck when I read a particular part of your book, which highlights some statistics around the extreme violence towards trans people, but specifically Black trans women. I was trying to imagine, given the statistics of the violent attacks, how Black trans women might feel just walking down the street every single day. And so now I know you don't have a solution necessarily for how we get through this, create a safer world, but what do you think the work is that organizations can do? So I get it, societally there's a lot of work as well, but what are organizations' role in supporting this particular niche group of people?
I think supporting any group of people that intersect all of those different identities, the key thing is the awareness firstly. Most people arguably at the moment would understand, whether they are against or for the support of trans rights, would understand that trans rights are in the news a lot at the moment. They understand that something is going on at the moment around either the lack of support for their view or the support of their view. But certainly from my perspective, it would be the eradication of trans rights, and certainly across the States and across the UK and so on. And I think when you're in that position where, if you're trying to help people move forward with supporting different communities, you have to tell stories and you have to share the data like I did in the book. And one of the things with data like this is that it doesn't lie. Data that is provided in those ways does not lie. Ones and zeros in that way are not false. So it's really clear that you have clear views that are supported by facts when it comes to how we advance the conversation, because all too often when it comes to having conversations on for example, small groups like this, people can't relate or understand because maybe they need to have a personal connection to something to really care about it. But certainly if you hear statistics like the ones I've shared in that book, you should not need a connection to someone to care about the fact that they're being victimised, that they have higher death rates, higher mortality rates, murder rates and so on as well. What companies need to do is they need to share those stories. They need to start talking about it in a very open way. All too often companies are too soft with how they speak about this when they're talking about, for example, supporting trans rights or Black trans women and so on. But what you really need to be talking about is the safety here. The lack of inclusion doesn't just lead to someone not feeling like they can bring their whole self to work. it leads to someone potentially being attacked or murdered.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about what some people might call soft things. We're talking about very real life and death scenarios. But if we don't have those very hard-hitting, far-reaching conversations, we lose the fact that this is so important. And I always think at the end of the day, we're not going to reach everyone. There are going to be people that don't get this. They don't want to get it. They're diametrically opposed and so on. What I try and get organisations to do is to focus on the majority of people that are willing to at least listen and learn and then move forward with what you can. But it has to start with telling stories, sharing data, sharing real examples for people to start to understand actually what's happening outside of their own bubble.
It does feel like people need support to understand what's happening outside of their own bubble, right? That the organisation does need to actively create space for that, but also that the organisation, so senior leaders in particular, role model how to have those sorts of conversations, because we're entering a space where people feel uncomfortable talking about things, that people don't want to acknowledge how challenging it is for trans people, for example, because especially if they don't know anyone who is trans, it's easy to shut down to the reality.
Yeah.
Again, the power of the statistics, right, that you've been speaking about. If organizations can bring that conversation with the data and role model how to have those conversations, it's the education piece, but there's also that dialing up of the perspective taking and empathy piece, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's easier for people to know what to do if they see someone else doing. That's just 101 with anything. Arguably, for the most part, in companies, people pay attention to leadership the most for obvious reasons. So it's really important that with that privilege and that power, that you do something with it. I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah. Another area, actually, that you touch upon around intersectionality in your book, which again made me stop and think, is around the concept of white feminism.
Yes.
And you offer an example of the suffragettes who are very esteemed, held in high regard for all of the positive work they did to shift society for women. And I think certainly for me, it feels like for women in general, but actually in your book, you highlight actually it wasn't women in general. They were racist, that the black women were disregarded from the fight.
Yeah.
Does white feminism play out in today's world? Do we see that, but we're just oblivious to it?
I mean, I think we see it very, very regularly. We see it in corporate spaces where diversity and inclusion strategies only prioritise women who are white from heterosexual backgrounds, who are financially stable and so on with no disabilities. We see white feminism prioritised because it's one from a perspective of most people in leadership are men who are white, and it's very easy to create a connection with we need to have more women in leadership. That must mean someone like me, white women, etc., etc. The other problem that we have is that people disregard the nuances of, in this case, women. And one of my Forbes pieces that I wrote, which is called "Women Are Not a Monolith and We Must Stop Treating Them as Such," is so important because we cannot, under any circumstances, think that under the blanket of women, that all women are treated equally, that white women and black women and Asian women are treated the same, that our experiences are all the same. What about disability? What about neurodiversity? What about financial background and socioeconomic background? All of those things change the access to opportunities that women have in this scenario. And with the suffragettes example, the thing for me, when I was researching and reading up and really understanding all about it, was that yes, arguably many people would think, when you hear about the suffragettes, there's adverts utilising their backgrounds on the TV all the time, from DNA ads and everything else. They're very well known. Most people, when you would say the suffragettes, will at least know something about them or what they've done, but arguably will probably not know about black women being left behind, about black women not having the vote when white women did, and that being diametrically opposed by many of the leading suffragettes as well. And what I think is so important about this, and in that example, is that we share those stories that, but yes, we can recognise that the advancement of white women in this scenario was historic, that getting white women the vote was phenomenal, but that doesn't mean we also can't recognise that there was racism involved and that black women were left behind as well, and that Sojourner Truth was the person who pushed to help black women get the vote. So I think it's so important that we don't lose the nuance of stories. And I think we see white feminism a lot when we start to look at how people show up, for example, as feminists, when people are on TV and we start to talk about feminists without recognizing that, let's say they're having a conversation on feminism and nobody there is of a different background other than being a woman and a white woman, when we forget that we create diversity and inclusion strategies and we leave race out of the equation, or when we leave disability out of the equation, which is one of the things that's the most left out, because people automatically tend to be drawn towards creating inclusion strategies that they directly identify with. Now, most people, as the research has shown us, in D&I roles or HR roles are white women. And that's why we tend to then see those other facets being left out, because they create strategies are created by people that they directly identify with. And the problem with that is, and I wrote about this in Demanding More as well, is that we then have exclusionary inclusion. We include certain people, but other people, we don't actually care about you. You'll be fine. Doesn't matter. And that's the problem. And with white feminism, where we see, people prioritizing the highest or the most privileged groups of women only, we leave behind so many people. And in this scenario, that's black women, which arguably in a lot of scenarios, it's black women as well, which is rooted in racism.
There's a lot of work to do there, it sounds like, when it comes to DEI strategy and how to create inclusive DEI strategies, which it seems ridiculous in so many ways that you would have a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy that isn't inclusive. But I completely see how anything that's designed by a certain group of people, unless they have a significant amount of diversity between them, that there would be a particular lens that they see the world, and therefore there's something that they don't see, which is, of course, the experiences of people who aren't like them. So what's the advice then for organisations creating their DEI strategy? Is it just to get as much diversity around the table as possible, or?
I think that's one way, but I also think that in many ways, there's no way to have everybody around the table. I don't think that's possible.
It's not practical, right?
Yeah, it's not practical. So, and this is where, when I wrote about this in Demanding More, and I've written about this a lot, that I used the software engineering principles that I've used in my past life to create D&I strategies. In technology, as a developer, you are consistently gathering requirements of what the client wants and how that client is going to interface with that product. You will do a lot of user research using user personas of different kinds of people that will interact with the solution you're creating to see whether it will pass or fail, whether it meets the needs of all of these different people. And this is exactly the same as what I do with D&I strategies. I don't have every single representation around the table because, one, it's not possible for the most part. It's not feasible either. But what I can do is spend time listening, learning, doing user research and research with different groups of people outside of my organization if they don't exist, to make sure that there are, in quotes, user personas that allows people to understand and allows the teams that I have to understand who are we trying to really help with this and why and how will this impact them. So the questions really here are, you have to make sure that you're asking the questions proactively and not reactively, and that you're using Agile, which is, that methodology of going around and around and around. We don't just create something and roll it out and it's finished, which is a waterfall model, which most people don't create software like that now for the most part. But you use Agile, which continually iterates. So even if you realize something is wrong, you change it instead of waiting until everything is finished and then changing it. And that's where I think it's really important for D&I professionals to recognize that we don't know everything. Anyone that tells you they do are lying to you and probably charging too much. So I think what's really important is to recognize that listening is a big part of this, and gathering user research is a big part of this. I also think it highlights that there's a big difference in doing D&I work, whether it's sort of entry level right the way up to VP and Chief Diversity Officer like me, is that passion and skill set are two different things. Passion for DE&I in roles is great, but it tends to create very clouded judgment when you're deciding on what to focus on. Because if I'm personally passionate just about, let's say, Asian women of colour, what about everybody else?
Yeah.
And that's where skill set comes in. That's where you come in and you think about this from a business perspective. Who are we trying to reach across the board? How does accessibility fit into this, and so on and so forth? And then create a strategy. Very often, too many people create a strategy that directly answers to the problems they face because they can relate to it. But actually, that's irrelevant. I don't need to just have a strategy that you relate to. I need to have a strategy that relates to all of my employees, all of the people I may want to work for the organisation as well.
Yeah, completely resonates with me. And in terms of working with certain clients where they have seen, for example, the statistics show them that there's a real specific need around gender. And so they just want a DEI strategy that focuses on gender.
Yeah.
And for me, that's the best way to exclude certain people.
Yeah.
It goes against all the principles of inclusion if you've just got a strategy that focuses on particular groups of people. And you've spoken there about your engineering background, and I really appreciate that. That's sort of how you've brought in agile project management principles into DEI work. And in one section of your book called Check Yourself, you talk about actually artificial intelligence, speech recognition software, and how actually there is bias within artificial intelligence. There's bias within speech recognition software, which, for example, might not be able to pick up atypical speech patterns. Okay. So that suggests to me where we might think that artificial intelligence and technology in general might support us in diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly in debiasing. Yeah, if you take out some of the human biases, the subjectivity, you'd hope that we would build in more objectivity. However, it seems to me, just like we've been talking about, that if a DEI strategy or if AI tool has been designed by specific people who are just seeing things through the lens of their own world, that's not going to help us at all with creating inclusion, right? So what's the work that needs to be done to design for inclusion?
The problem that we have with using AI to debias processes or to replace human decisions and so on is that if we make the assumption that everything that is utilizing AI is automatically debiased in itself, we are forgetting that at the end of the day, people have created that software. Now, if we go back to what I said at the start, that very often we create strategies and solutions without considering how they impact everyone proactively instead of reactively. We see huge technology companies, for example, rolling out voice notes or different tools and so on without considering, for example, disabled people that have different accessibility needs and then reactively trying to fix it. The problem that we have with AI is that if we cannot be sure the people creating it have been appropriately, in quotes, debiased themselves, and everybody is biased. I'm biased, of course I am, everybody is, but I spend a lot of time making sure the decisions I make are really well thought out before I choose yes or no on anything. And I think what we have to do is when we ensure the engineers that are working on those things, the testers, the developers, the business analysts and so on, we have to be very careful that there is a rigorous process in place to create inclusive tech, which means, like I said at the start, really rigorous testing around who this affects, how it affects them, what are the actual impacts, how does it work whenever the AI itself starts to learn different things, how does it learn and create connections based on the bias that is already there from all of us in society. And it's a big, big ask. This is not easy, and we can see that, AI is getting more and more prevalent. We see photos every day where people have to ask now, is that real or is it not? Is this something that's actually happened or is it fake? I don't know anymore. So we have to be really careful with that. I personally really avoid using AI tools and stuff like that because I'm not confident. It's certainly not right now anyway, because it's still very early on, that it's being developed in a way that really embraces diversity and fosters inclusion. The other thing with the technology industry in these fast-moving industries is it obviously moves very fast. I've worked in startups, I've led startups, I know what that's like, but that means that there's a lot of room for error as well. There's a lot less time to take a breath and really decide what are we doing now and how does it affect person A, B, C, D, and I'm not willing to take that risk. So
yeah, and it seems to me that those organizations, companies that are developing AI tools really do need to take a step off the fast lane if that's possible. As you say, it's an incredibly fast-moving market. I get it. They need to be at the cutting edge. If they don't move quickly, they'll lose out to their competitors. There's lots of people wanting to get in on this market space. However, it's almost like, they need to slow down to speed up. And
yeah, it has to be regulated in the same way that banks are regulated.
Exactly.
There has to be regulations with stuff like this because it is going to cause real-life effects on people.
Yeah.
And with that, you have to have a regulated industry. It can't just be rolling stuff out. It can't just be A, B, C, D, E. It has to be very carefully and concisely reviewed and so on too. So again, that's where the role of government comes in. Very important.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk to you about something you speak about in your book, which is just so happens to be incredibly relevant to the time that we're now speaking. Okay.
Go for it.
I'm going to quote you in your book. And you're talking about universities, right? And you're talking about privilege that comes with going to elite universities specifically. So you say, I want us to think of the barriers to accessing those kinds of universities. There are steep fees, but even steeper cultural and economic association barriers. And so you can see where I'm heading with this one, which is, so recently, the US Supreme Court ruled against race-based affirmative action. And based on your quote, it seems that actually affirmative action is exactly what we need, given the disparities in cultural, economic situations and the barriers to accessing these elite universities. And we know that those who go to those sorts of elite universities get access to the best jobs, right? They progress a lot faster. As soon as you see those elite universities on someone's CV or on LinkedIn, automatically you assume quality of candidate. So, very broad question. What's your take on the US Supreme Court ruling?
We live in a world, especially within the US, where everything is politicized to the extent that there are decisions made, that there are scenarios happening, that even if the best answer is in the middle or on the opposite side of what you think, people are too busy being on a 1 or a 0 side. And I grew up in the north of Ireland, okay? So people are not aware of the context of politics in the north of Ireland. I would really urge you to go and look it up. There's also a really good BBC documentary on the Civil War in Ireland that has just come out, which kind of shows what that means, which is a slight tangent, but I know what it's like to grow up somewhere. You're a 1 or you're a 0 and that's it. And what I see in the US is a very similar mindset where decisions are made because of aligning to certain political leaders, even if the views are not necessarily what you agree with either. I think one, that's incredibly dangerous. And again, as someone who has grown up in a place like that, I can see how dangerous it is and how hard it is for a place to break away from that. The other thing that I think why this is happening in the US is that when we talk about embracing diversity, the people that are taking issue with this, who are for the most part from majority demographics, have it like Sean and them, where there's a difficult moment of awareness where, have I not succeeded because maybe I'm not good enough, or have I not succeeded because somebody else has had a leg up and I haven't? And more often than not, it's the first one. We are not all great at what we do, okay? Not everybody is fantastic and not everybody is wonderful. That's how the world works and that's how the world is. But there are different access points to opportunity here. I think it's really important when we start to see people who have those same access points already get annoyed that other people are getting the same access that they already have, that the conversation here really is on insecurity. And it's very, very unfortunate, in my view, that we end up then in a scenario where something that does make a difference, where we get not just different diversity into those universities. I went to a Russell Group university in the UK, which is the equivalent of those ones in the States. So I know what it's like to have that privilege of when people see Queen's University on my CV, and when they see that I'm a Queen's Graduate of the Year and all those things that mean that automatically there's an assumption of intelligence based on the location of where I've studied. I know that that exists, because it has greatly benefited me earlier in my career as well. What I think is important in this scenario is for the people that recognise that we're taking step backs by doing this, is that we speak up. It's really dangerous whenever these big, huge decisions are changing and happening, that if we disagree with it, we stay quiet. When we stay quiet, it becomes so commonplace that these things happen that it's not an issue anymore, because, well, nobody's saying anything. I want people to speak up. I want you to say why you think it's wrong. I want people to talk about the benefits of affirmative action, for example. And also the statistics that are wildly against what the majority of people are saying as well. This isn't about taking from someone to give to someone else, as opposed to creating a level playing field. And again, I think it's really distressing to be in a world where we've got down a path now where, we see things like the insurrection and stuff like that, where these kinds of views, these kinds of violent views and violent opinions that are firstly put online on platforms like Twitter, for example, that aren't regulated in the way they need to be for safety perspectives, that then come together and then can end up in something like that. And I think that's where the danger comes into play here, that when people don't speak out against it as well, then those loud voices, those loud voices become the majority, even when they're not the majority. So I think that's where we're in a very touchy, uncomfortable, but very dangerous spot at the moment when it comes to supporting the rights of underrepresented people.
Agree. And I hear you in terms of needing everyone who feels something around this US sort of Supreme Court ruling feels that it's the wrong way to go, to be talking about it. And actually for organizations to be opening up, again, that safe space for people to discuss, right? Because the power of change, and it comes through people having conversations about it. So there might be people out there who are oblivious to what's happening in the States, and it would be very helpful if people knew. And B, if people have heard about it, but no one in their organization is talking about it, then, as you say, sort of by default, it must be okay. It must be the way that things are going, especially when there's people of power. We blindly think that people in power must be right. So it must be, oh, right, okay, well, maybe there is something wrong with positive affirmative action then. Maybe I haven't really thought that through. I kind of thought it was a good thing, but maybe there is something wrong. And so unless we bring those sorts of conversations into organizations and start talking about it, I think, as you say, it just gets accepted and naturally forms part of our societal belief system. So I think you're right. We're on quite rocky ground at the moment from a diversity, equity and inclusion perspective. And I suppose one of my biggest fears is that extends beyond where we are and it continues to evolve that way, where laws that have been changed in the past to create more equity and more inclusion are now going to be overturned, not just in the US, but in other parts of the world too. And in your book, you do talk, there's lots of practical tips actually to demand more, to demonstrate more allyship as well. I'm curious as to whether there's a particular tool or tip or something that you've maybe applied in your organization or personally that has made the most difference in terms of allyship and in terms of demanding more from the system.
So in demanding more, there's lots. I think there's two ones that I think every organization can do. And the first one, which I think is relevant for everyone, regardless of whether you're a VP or whether you're a brand new, fresh-faced graduate and so on, is sharing growth opportunities. When we think about progressing in our careers and when we think about widening our networks and so on, a lot of that comes down to growth opportunities. So opportunities in the workplace where you're able to do something that's difficult for you, that's a fire to put out and so on, showcase that you're ready to move to the next level, that you're ready to be paid more, whatever it might be. If we don't share growth opportunities, then we hold a lot of those opportunities for ourselves. More often than not, that happens because one, we've done it a lot of times before, so we know we can do it quickly and easily. Or two, the person who's entrusting the growth opportunities on us may be from a similar background as us, so therefore as an affinity bias towards you to think that you're the best person. When you get to any level in your career, there's going to be a point where you're given things that are not necessarily pushing you outside of your boundaries anymore. But for other people on your team or other people around you, that may be something that helps them progress, that helps them push that envelope open just a little bit more. And what I say to people is that to start to think about when you get new opportunities, is it something that you're going to benefit from a growth perspective, an expertise or an experience perspective, or actually is there a lot of weight in passing that opportunity to someone else who maybe could use that in a way that you've had to use it in the past? I think that's the first thing. The second thing, which is more relevant from a company-wide scale, is sponsorship. And every company that I've worked with, which I lost count of now, I always implement a sponsorship program. Very often people will think sponsorship is the same as mentorship. Mentorship is about sideline advice, sort of offline help, sharing your own career to help other people take snippets from it. Whereas sponsorship is very direct intervention and very, very direct advocacy for someone who is within a similar vertical or business unit to you. The reason that that's important is research has shown that when it comes to women and multicultural professionals, more often than not, they receive a mentor instead of a sponsor. And those that receive a sponsor have a higher rate of acceleration into leadership and growth. So what I do is and we've done this in Valtech as well, is that I always implement a structured framework to make sure that one, everybody has the same experience. So I would know how to be a really good sponsor because I've been doing it for a long time. Somebody new who's maybe a director or a VP level may not have that same experience. So training has to be provided to make sure everybody's on the same page. We have to set up frameworks that people can utilize to help guide conversations to make sure we're having meaningful conversations instead of just ranting spheres, which doesn't help. And then we also have to make sure we take global nuance. So in Valtech, we piloted this last year across 7 entities, and this year we're now going across 16 entities. So more than doubling our efforts. But the framework is the same everywhere. The process for applying, etc. is the same, but what's different is the criteria. So for example, underrepresented proteges is what we call folks. Underrepresented means something very different in Brazil than it does in Switzerland.
Yes.
So whilst the framework is the same, the criteria for being a protege is different in every entity.
Yeah.
So for example, in India, we are focusing on women on the cusp of leadership as proteges. In the UK, we're focusing on women, mid-tier women and people of colour. In Switzerland, we're focusing on women and non-native folks, so folks that are not originally from Switzerland. So in all of the entities, time has been spent really analysing what do we mean when we say underrepresented, and how do we really shift the narrative for that focus of that group, or groups plural. And that's where sponsorship is so important. So last year we saw a significant increase in how the proteges had rated their confidence, their desire to share their ideas, and their ability to share their ideas both in peer level room, but also then at a leadership level, which is what we were really focusing on. And I'm super excited to see, how we really go for this full year now until I think it's November 2024 that program will finish. And then we'll review, we'll see any mistakes that we've made, and we'll launch it again in March 2025 with a whole new cohort. But that's what's important, it's the nuance. It's recognizing that, for example, let's say if we were just to do women across the board for the Accelerating into Leadership program, that doesn't make sense, because actually in Brazil and in Toronto and Chicago, women are well represented in our senior leadership teams and in our mid-tier management, because those areas are mostly focusing on design. So there's a lot of different diversity. So that's why the nuance and the sort of picking apart the data to understand where you're at is key. So sharing growth opportunities and creating sponsorship frameworks, I think, are the main two ways that you can really change that dial.
Incredible. And thank you for those examples that you're doing at Valtech, and the sponsorship program sounds incredible. Very much looking forward to hearing more. Now, I've got a final question for you, which I've been asking all of my guests on Why Care this season. And it's because I'm writing a book, which is out in March next year, called Beyond Discomfort. And I'm interested in one of the most uncomfortable things that you have had to manage as a DEI practitioner, as you've navigated through some of the complexities of your own upbringing. Can you offer an example of how you have moved beyond discomfort?
Yeah, of course. So when you create something, when you brand something like that, you have so much ownership of it. You're trying your best to make it succeed. It's ultimately like a startup for me when I was doing that. It was difficult, but I was making a lot of fast-paced decisions. I was bringing on team members and so on. And I was thrust into leadership. I was doing stuff that most fresh-faced graduates were not doing. I was leading teams and building teams in all of these remote locations, helping create networks, sitting in the rooms with execs and so on of companies all around the UK at that stage. And that meant that I was holding on too tight. So I was holding the reins so tightly that it meant the teams that I was building, I was micromanaging them. Of course, I was like demoralizing them, because I was like, I need this to go right. So I need you not to do this, and I need you to do this, and I don't want you to do that. And why did you do this? And why did you not tell me? And of course, that meant that the team then took a step back, and they were not happy because they're not getting the growth opportunity they wanted from joining this team, because I was holding everything so tightly. And I got to a point when I realized my success does not have to have Sheree Atcheson on it. My success can have anybody's name on it. It doesn't have to be me. It doesn't have to be directly to me. If this team succeeds, that is my success. And I realized that, and I had a moment where I just stood back and I let them, and they made mistakes, and they also did great work. But that's the whole point. They had to make mistakes. I have to let people do that. And that, I guess, one of the real learnings from that was the ability of recognizing when it's your turn to step back and let someone else run, but also recognizing the power of matching pace. So I move very fast. It's something I've always had to work on. I go from 0 to 100. When I do personality tests and those kinds of things, I'm very red, but I'm also yellow and empathetic and stuff, but I'm very direct. And a lot of people, when I communicate, I'm very blunt as well, because I'm Irish. But a lot of people weave when they talk. It takes them a while to get to the point and so on. They like to think things out loud and everything, and that's totally fine. Mine's the opposite. And there's been times where it's like a rabbit just racing on ahead, and I've forgotten that I've left people behind because they're still figuring out what's going on. And so I've had to make sure when I'm working on teams and I'm leading teams now as a VP and a Chief Diversity Officer that I make sure that I match the pace of the people around me. And that's been something that's even relevant in my own relationships. I know I'm been married to my partner for 6 years. We've been together 12 years. He weaves and I am very direct. So I've had to learn to make sure that, I don't just go straight ahead and that he doesn't just go super slow either, that there's a middle part there that's the best of both worlds. And so that lesson has been useful, both from a work perspective and making sure I'm happily married. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that personal story, but also everything that you've shared with me today. Sheree, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on Why Care. If people are interested in connecting with you, what sort of social platforms are you on?
So best to get me on LinkedIn or Twitter or my website, which is shereeatcheson.com. You can always get me there.
Excellent. Well, we'll put all of the links on the show notes of our page, the usual place, abonairconsultingservices.com under podcasts. Sheree, thank you 100 times over. You are incredible at what you do, and it's just been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia.
That concludes episode 36 of Why Care. I could honestly chat to Sheree all day. She has so much to offer in terms of knowledge and guidance to support organisational inclusion. Her humility and vulnerability in sharing her personal story, I feel, is what makes her words so powerful. Her book, Demanding More, is available on Amazon and is very much worth the read. You can find me on Insta, LinkedIn and X, formerly Twitter, with the handle @NadiaNagamutu. As always, I really appreciate your support of this podcast through leaving a review on whatever platform you're listening and spreading the word by sharing it with your friends and family. Huge thanks to Mauro at Kenji Productions for editing this podcast and Glory Olubori for supporting with the show notes and getting it out there on social media.